The chamber was built to make you feel small. That was the point. Yale Drawson walked through the tall doors and felt the familiar pull in her lower back. 11 years of sitting in a chair built for a species with 4 lumbar spines would do that. She didn't rub it. She walked to her platform, the low one, far left, near the venting system that always smelled like something burning, and set her bag down. She pulled out her thermos. The coffee was cold. She drank it anyway. The Galactic Council chamber held 46 seats arranged in a curved arc that climbed upward like stadium seating. The older your species membership, the higher your seat. Simple system. Clean insult. The Veil sat near the top. The Dravathi sat higher. At the very peak, the Orun, a species so old the original bench had been replaced 4 times, and the people who built it had gone extinct. Humans stood on the ground floor. No seats. Not yet. Maybe not ever, if the last 11 years meant anything. Yael looked at her notes, paper notes, in her own handwriting, which the council's junior clerks always stared at like she'd brought a rock through customs. She didn't care. Paper didn't crash. Paper didn't need a power source. Paper was just paper. And sometimes, that was the most reliable thing in a room full of species who had faster-than-light travel for 40,000 years and still couldn't find time to answer a trade proposal. One word at the top of the page. Confirmed. The session opened the way they all opened. The clerk, a Pethrani, small and gray, whose vocal cords turned human speech into something between a squeaking hinge and a tired animal, read the agenda aloud. When it came to the human delegation's petition, the translation came out as, "The small-lived ones request again their customary shelf." The gallery moved. Not laughter, exactly. Not all 46 species laughed. But something passed through the room like a wave. A shared moment. A joke everyone understood and no one was going to stop. Yael wrote nothing. She watched Archdelegate Sorith of the Veil. Sorith was tall and pale, covered in bioluminescent patterns that shifted across his skin the way thoughts moved across a face. The Veil had 2 languages, the one they spoke out loud and the one they couldn't control. When Sorith addressed the human delegation, his light went to its lowest setting, a flat, dead glow. In Veil culture, that was how you spoke to furniture. He delivered the council's formal response without once looking up from his display. No vote, no timeline, no denial, just deferral. The petition would remain under continued review. The human delegation was thanked for its continued patience. The session would proceed to other business. He spoke to the display the entire time. Not once to her. Yael let him finish. She let the silence hold for 3 full seconds after he stopped. A negotiator's habit. It made people think you were weighing something. Then she stood. The human delegation, she said, will be withdrawing from further council proceedings. Nothing happened. That was the strange part. No gasps, no sharp voices, no dramatic signal from the universe that something had changed. A few delegates looked up. Sorith's skin light flickered, fast, brief, involuntary, and then went flat again. She picked up her thermos. She looked at her aide, Theo, 24 years old. He had the expression of a man who had just watched someone pull the pin from something and was not sure he was far enough away. They walked to the door. The human-installed door. They'd put it in during year 2, after it became clear the council's standard doors were built for species with different proportions. Just the one door, at the end of the human corridor. 1,400 doors throughout the complex, and this one cut to fit. No one had ever questioned it. No one had ever tried to remove it. It opened cleanly. It closed behind them with a soft click, like the last word of a very long argument. In the corridor, Theo walked beside her in silence until he couldn't anymore. Did it work? Yael didn't answer. Not because she didn't know, She'd known for 8 years how this would go, if she stayed patient long enough to let it develop. She knew about the buoys, the stations, the 4,000 pages of trade proposals sitting unread in the Council's deferral archive. The 3 allied species who had reached out quietly after Year 7, when they started running their own numbers. She knew about the Teth Viral provision sitting untouched in the Council's own legal code, like a key no one had picked up in 3,000 years. She knew all of it. She didn't answer because the answer wasn't finished yet. It was still becoming. You didn't name things before they were done. That was how you lost them. She stopped at the vending machine in the corridor. The machine stocked nothing that humans considered food or drink. The closest option was a warm mineral broth that tasted like metal and old water. She filled her thermos with it. She had a long trip back to Earth, and cold was worse than terrible. Theo was still watching her. She handed him the secondary document folder, the one with the communication logs from the 3 allied species, the ones who had reached out quietly, privately, after they started calculating what the human buoy network actually meant for corridor routing. Cross-reference Article 9 with the Vale Infrastructure Dependency Reports, she said. I want the timeline clean before we land. He took the folder. He held it for a moment. They were laughing in there. I know. Doesn't that? He stopped, tried again. Doesn't that bother you? She thought about it, genuinely. Not with feeling first, but with function. What did being bothered cost? What did it build? What purpose did it serve past the moment it happened? Year 3, she said. The clerk translated my opening statement as the small-lived ones. That was the moment. You don't spend energy being bothered by a decision that's already been made. She started walking. You change the conditions. He was quiet, the way young people were quiet, when they were trying to memorize something without looking like they were memorizing it. Behind them, the chamber settled back into its regular business. Sorith moved on to the next item on the agenda. His skin light ran dim and flat, the way it always did when addressing minor procedural matters. Except, there had been that flicker. Brief, involuntary, the kind Sorith's own instructors had told him, years ago, was the one pattern he would never be able to fake or hide. In Vale, it meant only one thing. I did not expect that. He had not expected that, and in the 43 years of his diplomatic career, there was almost nothing left that he had not expected. He kept his eyes on the display. He kept his light flat. But in the empty space where the human delegation had been standing, the floor looked different somehow. Not changed, just noticed. Like a door you'd walked past 1,000 times, and one day, for no reason you could name, you actually saw it. He looked back at his display. The session continued. The delays started small. 0.3 seconds, then 0.7, then gaps that lasted long enough for mid-session transmissions to stall, for data packets to arrive out of order, for the Council's routine communications to feel like a conversation through bad glass. The Vale Technical Division filed it under solar interference, standard notation, barely a footnote. Then it got worse. Secondary relay channels began cutting out. Not fully, never fully, not in a way that demanded immediate action, but enough that junior delegates started complaining. Enough that a data courier from the Dravathi sector arrived 3 days late, and no one could explain why. Enough that a Vale intelligence officer named Thessaly, who had been doing her job without recognition for 14 years, pulled the transit maps and started cross-referencing signal paths against known infrastructure positions. She found the buoys, 212 of them, placed across 11 years of human scientific survey missions at points where the gravitational conditions were perfect. Not just for observation, for routing. Each buoy was a small, quiet machine that received signals, held them, and passed them along, passively, cleanly, without announcing itself. The way a post office works. Reliable, unremarkable, easy to forget was even there. Until it wasn't there. Thessaly ran the numbers 3 times before she wrote the report. She wanted to be wrong. She was a thorough person, and thorough people always check twice when the answer made them uncomfortable. But the numbers held, every time. Remove the buoys without replacement infrastructure, and 3 minor relay chains would collapse immediately. 1 major channel would degrade by 60% within a week. She delivered the report to Archdelegate Sorith personally. He read the first page. He set it down. "Remove the buoys," he said. Thessaly had prepared for this response. She explained, carefully, that removing the buoys without replacing their routing function would require 6 months of infrastructure work, and a budget allocation that would need full council approval. Sorith told her to begin the rerouting process. She paused, just briefly. "The budget will be approved," he said. He was already looking at his next document. She gathered her report and left. In the corridor she stopped walking for a moment. Her skin light moved through a pattern her colleagues almost never saw on her. The slow, uneven ripple that meant she was recalculating. Not her conclusion. Her understanding of how she had arrived at a conclusion that should have been obvious much earlier. She started walking again. She did not say what she was thinking. She had worked in Veil intelligence long enough to know which thoughts were useful to speak aloud, and which ones were only useful to carry. Yael Drawson was on Earth. She was eating actual food, real food, from a real kitchen, prepared by her sister, who was not a diplomat, and had no interest in being one, and made a lentil soup that tasted like the opposite of everything the council's vending machines offered. Her back had stopped hurting 3 days after she landed. She sat at her sister's kitchen table in the evenings, with her intelligence reports spread out in front of her, and a cup of coffee that was actually hot. And she read, she circled things. She drew lines between circled things. Her sister occasionally came in, looked at the papers, said nothing about the papers, and refilled the coffee. The reports were good, better than she had expected, which meant her expectations had been right. The buoy removal order had been issued. The rerouting process had started. The costs were already coming in higher than Sorith's team had projected, because Sorith's team had not done a full audit before issuing the order. They had assumed the work would be simpler than it was. This was what happened when you never took something seriously enough to study it. She circled the budget figure, drew a line to the corridor dependency map. She wrote 1 number in the margin, 7, the number of council species whose trade routes ran through corridors that would be partially degraded during the rerouting window. Not destroyed, not blocked, just slower, slightly more expensive. The kind of friction that wouldn't cause a crisis, but would cause questions. Questions were useful. She also read the reports from her 3 quiet contacts. The 3 council species who had reached out to the human delegation during Year 7, and then again after the withdrawal, and who were now very carefully, very privately running their own calculations. Their messages were diplomatic in language and extremely direct in meaning. They wanted to know what the humans were planning, not to stop it, to understand whether they should be on the right side of it. Yael wrote back to each of them. Same message, slightly different tone for each species' communication culture. The message said, "We are preparing a proposal for formal partnership review. We would welcome your input on the draft framework. We ask only that you keep this preliminary contact private for the next 6 months." All 3 responded within 48 hours. That was itself an answer. She folded the reports and put them in the document case. She called Theo. He answered on a first signal. He was still working, which she expected. He was the kind of person who worked because the work was in front of him, not because someone was watching. She had recruited him for exactly that. The timeline on Article 9, she asked. Ready. 3 redundancies and a failsafe clause. If they try to defer the Teth Verol review the way they've been deferring everything else, The failsafe activates the public record provision automatically. Good. How long until we go back? She looked out the kitchen window. It was late. The street outside was dark and quiet, in the way streets were quiet in towns where nothing was happening and everything was fine. 6 months, she said. Let the rerouting costs land first. Let the 7 corridor species feel the friction. Let them ask the questions. Theo was quiet for a moment. And then they'll want an answer. And we'll have one ready. She ended the call. She sat for a while, with the cold coffee, looking at the document case. In the Vale Intelligence Division, Thessaly was still at her desk. She had started a second report that nobody had asked for. A full audit of every human registration, every human filing, every human outpost and survey mission over the past 31 years. She had started it because the buoy report had unsettled her in a specific way. The kind of specific way that meant she had found the surface of something and had not yet found the bottom. She worked late into the night. Her skin light moved slow and even, the pattern of a person doing careful work. She was not going to like what she found. She already knew that. But Thessaly was a thorough person. She checked everything twice. Thessaly's second report took 61 days to complete. She presented it to Soreth in the same room where she had presented the buoy report. Same table, same chairs. She set the file down in front of him. It was significantly thicker than the first one. He looked at the thickness of it. Summarize, he said. She had prepared a summary. She read it aloud. She kept her voice level and her skin light flat, because she was a professional, and professionals did not let a briefing become a performance. She told him what the humans had done in 31 years of contact access. They had learned 7 council languages, not just conversational, academic-level fluency. They submitted formal translations for peer review in years 4, 5, and 6. The peer reviews were never returned. They had mapped 9 of the Council's 11 primary hyperspace corridor networks, not because they needed to, because they were given star charts and basic survey tools, and apparently could not be in the presence of an incomplete map without filling it in. The mapping was published openly in human academic journals. Several Council species scholars had access to those journals. None of them had flagged the content. They had built 12 stations in neutral registered space. The registration forms were standard, and the Council's approval was automatic. Neutral space registration for non-military outposts was a simple formality, never reviewed in detail. The stations were not armed, but Thessaly had pulled the architectural specs, and the stations were built with shielding and internal redundancy that made them easy to hold and difficult to disable. Someone had thought carefully about what a station looked like when a species that currently had no military decided it might eventually need one. They had filed 4,000 pages of trade proposals, agricultural exchange, medical technology licensing, infrastructure co-development, shared research frameworks. The proposals were detailed, well-structured, and economically sound. The Council's trade archive had held them in deferral status for 11 years. Thessaly had confirmed that the Economics Division had never read past page 40 of the first volume. Soreth was very still. She kept going. In year 4, a human graduate student named Aurea Venn had submitted a doctoral thesis. The subject was the structural dependency map of the Council's economic network. Which species relied on which corridors? Which trade relationships were fragile? Which infrastructure nodes were single points of failure? The thesis was published in an open academic journal available to all Council species. It had been available for 27 years. No one had read it. Thessaly set the paper copy of the thesis on the table next to the report. She was that kind of thorough. Soreth looked at it. He did not pick it up. "Is the economic analysis accurate?" he asked. "I had our economics team review it," Thessaly said. They confirmed it. In most places, the human student's analysis was more precise than our own internal documents. She paused. The section on veil corridor dependency is particularly detailed. Soreth's skin light moved. She had seen that pattern before, but rarely. It was the one that meant something had moved in a direction he had not prepared for. She let it settle before she continued. There is one more item, she said. She pulled the last document from the file and set it on the table. It was a contact log. 31 years of formal and informal communications between the human delegation and various council member species. Most of it was standard diplomatic exchange. Formal, polite, unremarkable. But she had highlighted certain exchanges. 3 council species. Quiet messages. No official record. The kind of communication that happened off the main channels, in the soft margins, where things were said before anyone committed to saying them officially. The 3 species had been talking to the humans. Soreth picked up the contact log. He read the highlighted sections. His light stayed flat and controlled, but the very control of it, the effort behind the flatness, told Thessaly everything she needed to know about what he was feeling. "Who else has seen this report?" he asked. "Only you," she said. He closed the file. He sat for a moment. She waited. "Continue monitoring," he said. She gathered her materials. At the door she stopped because something made her stop. Not strategy, just the basic pull of honesty that sometimes came over even careful people. "Delegate Soreth," she said. "The buoy network, the stations, the corridor mapping, the thesis. None of it was hidden. It was all filed, published, registered, or submitted through official channels." She held the file against her side. "We had access to all of it for years." He didn't respond. She left. On Earth, Yale was giving a guest lecture at a university in the northern city where she had grown up. The auditorium held 200 students. She had not prepared slides. She stood at the front with her thermos and talked about the mechanics of long-term negotiation. When to speak, when to wait, what silence cost, what silence earned. A student near the back raised a hand. "What do you think happens next, with the council?" Yale considered the question the way she considered most things. Not quickly, not slowly, at the right speed for the real answer. "They'll make contact," she said. "They'll have questions." "How can you be sure?" "Because they're starting to feel something they haven't felt in a long time." She took a drink from their thermos. Friction. Small things that cost more than expected. Routes that take longer. Budgets that run over. None of it is catastrophic. But all of it is new. And new friction always produces questions. Another student asked, "What if they just replace the infrastructure and go back to ignoring you?" Yael almost smiled. "Not quite." "They can try," she said. But the buoys didn't matter because of what they did. They mattered because of where they were. Position isn't something you replace quickly. It takes years to build the kind of position that makes your absence inconvenient. She set the thermos down on the lectern. "We had 11 years. We used them." The first student again. "But they didn't take you seriously." "No," Yael said. "They didn't." She picked up the thermos. "That was the best thing that ever happened to us." She moved to the next question. In the back of the auditorium, Theo sat with his notebook in his lap. He had heard her say this before, or things close to it. But each time she said it, it meant something slightly different, because each time he understood slightly more of what was underneath it. He circled something in his notebook. He didn't look up. Outside, the sky was ordinary and gray. The kind of gray that looked like nothing was happening. The kind of gray that was, in fact, full of things happening quietly. 31 years of things. All of them filed, published, registered, submitted through proper channels. All of them sitting in the open, waiting to be read by someone paying enough attention. Patience looks like weakness until it looks like a wall. She had said that once. Theo had written it down then too. He was beginning to understand what the wall was made of. 6 months and 4 days after the human delegation walked out of the council chamber, a formal communication arrived on Yael's desk. It was from the council secretariat. Not from Sarith, not from any named delegate. The secretariat, the administrative body, the record keepers, the people who process the paperwork. They were requesting that the human delegation submit a new petition for observer status review. Yael read the message twice. She set it down. She wrote back the same day. The human delegation would be happy to return for a session. She enclosed the agenda filing with the message. The agenda was 4 pages long. The final item listed under Procedural Matter 3C cited Teth Varal. The Secretariat took 2 days to respond. She imagined them reading the word, checking the records, pulling the 3,000-year-old provision from the legal archive that nobody had opened since the Council's 2nd century of existence. She imagined the moment they confirmed it was real, valid, filed correctly, irrevocable under Council law, once formally cited. She imagined that took a while. The session was confirmed. The chamber looked the same. That was the first thing Theo noticed when they walked in. Same arc of rising seats, same venting smell, same low platform on the far left where the human delegation was expected to stand. Yael walked to the platform. She stopped. She looked at it. Then she walked past it and set her materials on the floor in front of the platform, at ground level. She arranged her papers. She placed her thermos beside them. She stood up straight. Theo looked at her. He looked at the platform. He looked at the floor. The difference in height was small. Maybe the length of his hand. He had studied enough council procedural law in the past 6 months to know exactly why it mattered. Teth Varal granted the invoking party the right to stand at chamber floor level. Not the observer platform, not the low tier. The ground. The same level as the chamber floor where the council delegates' own support staff stood during full sessions. It was a technical distinction that the provision defined precisely, and that no one had ever actually used. Until now. The delegates filed in. Several of them glanced at where she was standing. A few looked at each other. No one said anything. Soref sat in his seat near the upper tier. His skin light was running a controlled, even pattern. She noted the effort behind it. The session opened. Yael spoke. She did not raise her voice. She had been a negotiator for 30 years, and the first rule of every good negotiation was that you did not tell people how to feel about what you were saying. You gave them the information and let the feeling arrive on its own. 11 years of procedural delay with no formal grounds for refusal. She cited the dates, the petition numbers, the deferral codes. She pulled them from memory. 4,012 pages of trade proposals, never formally declined, never approved, never reviewed past the first volume. She cited the filing references. 212 communication buoys, positioned and registered through proper neutral space protocols over 11 years of survey operations, which the Council had passively relied on for corridor routing without acknowledging or compensating for their infrastructure function. She laid this out quietly, without heat, as a simple structural fact. 12 research stations, registered and approved through standard Council neutral space protocols, built to specifications that any reasonable infrastructure review would have flagged as dual use. She noted that no review had been conducted. She named the 3 Council species who had been in quiet contact with the human delegation for the past several years. She named them clearly, said their full formal designations, said the years the contact began, said what they had discussed. The gallery was very still. Soreth's skin light flickered. Then again, the kind of double flicker that Theo, watching from the observation level, had spent 6 months learning to read. He wrote it in his notebook. He circled it. Yael continued. She said that the human delegation was not requesting observer status. Observer status was a seat at someone else's table. That was no longer what they were here to discuss. She placed the framework document on the floor in front of her. 230 pages, co-authored by human trade specialists and the 3 allied species. It proposed a formal partnership structure, not membership, not observation, but a defined relationship of mutual benefit, with infrastructure credit for the buoy network, co-development rights on the 12 stations, and an economic framework based on the 31 years of proposals that had never been answered. She said the 3 allied species were prepared to co-sign. She said that 4 additional council species had been independently reviewing the corridor dependency data for the past 3 months, and that their delegations would be available to discuss their findings, if the council wished. She said that the HFY provision required a majority review within 90 days, and that the review could not be procedurally deferred. She sat down, she refilled her thermos. The chamber held its silence for a long moment. Then Soreth spoke. His light was not. He said that the council would need time to review the framework document. He said that several procedural questions would need to be examined. He said that the HFY provision had not been formally invoked in 3,000 years, and that its current applicability would need to be assessed. Yael looked at him across the chamber floor. The provision doesn't require your agreement on its applicability, she said. Only its citation. It's cited. The 90-day clock started when the agenda was filed. Soreth's light ran a pattern she had not seen from him before. Something that moved fast across his collarbone and then stopped. A pattern without a clean name in the translation guides. She had asked a Veil linguist about it once, in a different context. The linguist had described it as the expression of someone who had just put their hand on something they could not let go of and could not keep holding. The session closed. In the corridor, Theo fell into step beside her. He had his notebook pressed against his chest. He had the expression of a man who had just watched something he had been told about, and had not fully believed until he saw it. The floor thing, he said. The 14 centimeters. Yes. They've never used that in 3,000 years. No. Why did no one use it? Yael stopped at the vending machine. The machine offered its usual options. She made her usual choice. The broth was warm and tasted like metal, and she drank it without complaint. Because it requires cause, she said. You can only invoke HFY if you have documented evidence of procedural bad faith over a sustained period. She screwed the cap back on. Most species gave up before they had enough. Theo thought about that. How long were you collecting? She looked at him. He had asked the right question. He was starting to ask the right questions reliably now, which was what she had brought him here for. Since year 1, she said. She started walking. Behind her, in the chamber, Soreth sat in his elevated seat and looked at the floor where she had stood. At the exact patch of ground, 14 centimeters below the observer platform. A distance so small you would never notice it unless you were looking for it. He had not been looking for it. He should have been looking for it. 3,000 years. No one had ever stood there. And now the floor looked different. Not changed, just visible in a way it had not been before. The same way an old door looks different the moment someone finally walks through it. He looked away. The 90-day clock was running. The vote came on day 61. Not because the council was ready. Because 4 of the 7 corridor species, whose trade routes had been grinding slower and more expensive for 6 months, asked for the vote to be moved forward. They had read the framework document. They had run the numbers. They did not want to wait another 29 days. Yael sat at the ground level of the chamber and watched the count come in. 9 in favor, 3 against, 2 abstentions. 1. The Orun, at the very top of the arc, the oldest seat in the room. A long, deliberate pause, followed by a single affirmative signal. The HFY review passed. The framework document went to formal committee with a 90-day processing window. not deferral, processing. Those were different words with different weights, and the council's own rules knew the difference. Theo, in the observation level, wrote the final count in his notebook. He just looked at it. Sorith requested a private meeting with Yael 2 hours after the session closed. It was the first time in 11 years he had requested to speak with her outside of a formal hearing. The meeting room was small and plain. Service level, not diplomatic. No elevated seating, no ceremony. A table and 4 chairs, all the same height. Sorith arrived alone. So did Yael. She set her thermos on the table. She waited. He sat down across from her. His skin light was running quiet and low, not the dismissive flat she knew from the chamber. Something older, slower. The light of someone who had stopped managing their own expression. He asked, "When did you know?" She told him. Year 3, the clerk's translation, the small-lived ones. She told him that in human crisis negotiation there was one signal that meant a counterpart had already decided against you. When they stopped translating you accurately. Not a language error. A choice. When someone translates your words in a way that makes the room laugh, they have already concluded you don't matter enough for precision. After that, she said, you stop trying to change their mind. You don't have access to their mind anymore. So you change the conditions instead. Sorith was quiet for a moment. His light moved slowly. Why didn't you leave, he asked, after year 3, after you knew? Why keep filing petitions that were never going to be approved? It was a real question. She treated it like one. Because the petitions weren't for you, she said. They were for the record. 11 years of dated, filed, formally submitted requests for review, all of them deferred without cause. That's not a failed negotiation. That's documented evidence. She picked up her thermos. You were helping us build our case every year you deferred. He sat with that. The buoys, he said. The stations. The mapping. Yes. None of it was hidden. No. We could have seen any of it. You could have, she agreed. The corridor mapping was in an open academic database. The station specs were in the Neutral Space Registry. The thesis was published 27 years ago. She set the thermos down. We didn't hide anything. We just filed it in places where people who didn't take us seriously wouldn't think to look. His light ran a long, uneven pattern across his arms. She had learned enough Veil in 11 years to read it roughly. It was not anger. It was something more uncomfortable than anger. The feeling of understanding something completely, and too late, at the same time. You could have built your own structure, he said. Your own governing body. Left the council entirely. You had the infrastructure to do it. Yael looked at him. We know what happens to species that seal themselves off, she said. We've seen it in our own history. Groups that decide the rest of the world isn't worth engaging with. They don't end well. She paused. We didn't want a wall. We wanted a seat. And when you wouldn't give us one, we built our own table and made it worth sitting at. He was quiet for a long time. The students, he said finally, the ones who will come after you. They'll know all of this, how it was done. Yes. That concerns me. It should, she said, simply, not as a threat, as a fact that deserved to be treated like one. But consider what else they'll know. They'll know that the solution was patience and paperwork and 31 years of showing up. They'll know that we didn't damage anything, didn't threaten anyone, didn't need to. She stood, picking up her bag. The lesson we leave behind isn't how to break the council. It's what happens when you take the long way because someone blocked the short one. She moved toward the door. Ambassador. She stopped. Sorith's light was fully dim, not the dismissive dim of the chamber. Something quieter, the dim of a species at the end of a long day. The translation, he said. In year 3, the small-lived ones. I know it was the clerk's choice, but I didn't correct it. She turned. He met her eyes properly, for the first time in 11 years. "I know," she said. She left. In the corridor outside, the building was mostly empty. It was late by Council Standard Time, which meant nothing to Yael's biology, but had become a rhythm she knew. She walked the long way back, past the delegate offices, past the records archive, past the hall where the trade proposal volumes sat in their deferral storage. 4,012 pages, starting to process at last, albeit a decade late. She stopped at the door. The human-installed door, at the end of the human corridor. Cut to fit, in year 2. Approved without comment. Never questioned. Never removed. She stood and looked at it. It was just a door. 1,431 standard doors in the complex, and this one was different by about 30 centimeters of height. Installed by a crew of 4 people on a Tuesday morning 11 years ago, because the council's doors were too tall, and someone had to solve the problem, and no one was going to solve it for them. That was the thing people never understood about the buoys, the stations, the thesis, the long patience, the 31 years of filed petitions and cross-reference documents, and quiet alliances built in the margins of a relationship the council had never taken seriously. None of it had been a plan in the beginning. It had just been a species that solved the problems in front of them, one at a time, without waiting for permission. The door was too tall, so they made a new one. The corridors weren't mapped, so they mapped them. The proposals went unanswered, so they kept filing them, and the filing became a record, and the record became a case. The infrastructure didn't exist, so they built it, and the building became position, and the position became leverage. They weren't playing a long game. They were just playing the only game available to them, methodically, thoroughly, with the specific stubbornness of a species that had once looked up at the stars from a small wet planet with no faster-than-light travel, and decided that the correct response to that situation was to figure it out. Theo appeared at the far end of the corridor. He had his notebook under his arm and his coat in his hand, and the expression of someone who had been waiting a while and had been patient about it. "The Framework Committee wants to schedule the first working session," he said. "They're asking for our availability." "Send them the first week of next month," she said, "and tell them we want Dr. Venn on the Infrastructure Subcommittee. The one who wrote the thesis. She's been waiting 27 years for someone to call." Theo wrote it down. They walked toward the exit. Yael put her hand briefly on the door, the human one, the short one, as she passed it. Not sentiment, just contact. The door was warm, the way things were warm when they'd been in a room a long time. She pushed it open and walked through. Behind her, in the council chamber, the elevated seats sat empty, and the ground-level floor was just a floor again, looking the same as it always had. The 90-day clock kept running. Outside, the stars were everywhere, the same stars that had looked impossible once, from a small wet planet, before someone decided that impossible was just another problem to solve. Yael walked to the transport bay. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do.